February 1934. New Bern, North Carolina. A cold morning mist hangs over the streets of this old river town. Inside a 3-story brick fortress on Middle Street, the man who created the world's most famous drink is dying. His name is Caleb Bradham, and the house where he takes his final breaths has witnessed nearly a century of American history. Civil War generals paced these hallways, planning battles that would reshape a nation. Wealthy merchants entertained guests in these elegant parlors. And for 26 years, Bradham himself called it home, watching from these tall windows as his American dream rose to spectacular heights and then crashed into ruin. The mansion still stands today, its red brick walls and low-hipped roof, a testament to the craftsmanship of another era. But the story it holds is more than architectural history. It is a tale of ambition, innovation, heartbreak, and one of the greatest business failures in American history. Because Caleb Bradham was not just any man. He was the inventor of Pepsi-Cola, the creator of a drink that would one day become one of the most recognized brands on earth. Yet he died nearly penniless, having lost everything to a gamble on sugar that destroyed his empire in a matter of weeks. He built this mansion as a mask, a fortress against the world. But today, we reveal the $500,000 secret he died with. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture, the hidden psychology of America's great estates, and the true cost of empires built on ambition, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We're about to step inside a house that witnessed the rise and fall of the American dream itself. To understand how a pharmacist from rural North Carolina created a billion-dollar beverage and then watched it slip through his fingers, we must travel back to a time when this house first rose from the Carolina soil, long before Bradham ever walked through its doors. The house that would become the Bradham estate began its life in 1848, when New Bern was one of the most important cities in North Carolina. The man who built it was Charles Edward Slover, a merchant who had arrived in the town as a young man with little more than ambition and a sharp mind for business. By his 40s, Slover had amassed considerable wealth through shipping and general merchandising. His cargo ships sailed regularly to the Caribbean, bringing back goods that made him one of the richest men in eastern North Carolina. Slover wanted a house that would announce his success to the world. He hired Hardy B. Lane, the most respected builder in New Bern, a man whose work on churches and schools had earned him a reputation for combining elegance with solid construction. Lane designed a 3-story mansion in the Greek Revival style, the most fashionable architectural choice of the antebellum South. The brickwork was laid in Flemish bond, an intricate pattern that alternated long bricks with short ones to create a wall that was both beautiful and incredibly strong. Brownstone trim accented the windows and doors, giving the house a sophistication that rivaled anything in the larger cities of the South. When construction was complete in 1849, the Slover House stood as the most imposing private residence in New Bern. Its proportions were perfect, its details exquisite. The tall windows flooded the interior with light, while the high ceilings kept the rooms cool, even in the sweltering Carolina summers. Slover had created exactly what he wanted, a monument to his achievements that would last for generations. But history has a way of interrupting even the grandest plans. In 1861, the Confederate States seceded from the Union and the Civil War began. New Bern, with its strategic location on the Neuse River and its connection to the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad, became a target for Union forces almost immediately. Charles Slover saw the storm coming. Unlike many of his neighbors who clung to their possessions and their Confederate loyalties until the last moment, Slover was a practical man. In the months between secession and the inevitable Union invasion, he quietly transferred most of his assets to British banks, where they would be safe from the chaos of war. Then he gathered his family and fled to High Point, far from the coastal battlefields. On March 14, 1862, the Battle of New Bern was fought just 5 miles south of the city. General Ambrose Burnside led 11,000 Union troops against 4,000 Confederate defenders who had hastily constructed earthworks along the railroad. The weather was cold and rainy, the roads thick with mud, but Burnside's forces pressed forward with relentless determination. By afternoon, the Confederate line had broken, and the defenders were in full retreat toward Kinston, more than 30 miles away. New Bern fell to the Union that same day, and it would remain occupied for the rest of the war. General Burnside needed a headquarters befitting his position as commander of the Department of North Carolina. His eyes fell upon the finest house in the city, the abandoned mansion of Charles Slover. For the next 3 years, the Slover House became the nerve center of Union operations in eastern North Carolina. The 18th Army Corps was headquartered there, and some of the most important military decisions of the Eastern Theater were made within its walls. General John G. Foster succeeded Burnside and made the house his personal residence as well as his command post. Photographers captured images of Foster and his staff standing on the broad front porch, their uniforms crisp, despite the chaos of war, the elegant columns of the house rising behind them, like symbols of the civilization they claimed to be fighting for. But the house also became home to something far more intimate and human. A woman named Mary Cord worked in the kitchen of the Slover mansion during the war years. She had been enslaved, separated from her family, and forced to cook for Confederate households before the Union occupation. Her story was so compelling that it caught the attention of a young writer who visited New Bern after the war. That writer was Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. He transformed Mary Cord's experiences into one of his most powerful short stories, a true story. In the tale, he called her Aunt Rachel, but her voice, her pain, and her extraordinary resilience were drawn directly from conversations that took place in the very rooms where generals had once planned battles. When the war ended in 1865, the Slover family returned to New Bern. Thanks to Charles Slover's foresight in protecting his assets, they were able to resume their prosperous life, while many of their neighbors struggled with the devastation of defeat. The mansion was cleaned, repaired, and restored to its former glory. Charles Slover continued to occupy it until his death in 1892, when he willed the house and its contents equally to his children. His son George acquired the property from the other heirs and maintained the family's presence in the grand house until 1905. Then a new chapter began. But before we meet the man who would buy this mansion and fill it with the sound of a billion-dollar dream, we need to understand something the history books rarely mention. Behind the Greek Revival columns and elegant parlors, behind the generals, strategy sessions, and the Slover family's dinner parties, there was an invisible machine. A network of human labor, sweat, and engineering that made all that grandeur possible. And it's time we step downstairs. Deep in the basement of the Slover mansion, boiler rooms the size of small factories kept the house warm through Carolina winters. Cast iron furnaces, tended every 4 hours, consumed half a ton of coal per week. The cost in 1860? Roughly $12 a week, or about $400 in today's money. But coal was the cheapest part. Mary Cord was not alone in that kitchen. A typical household of this scale required at least 8 full-time servants, a head cook, 2 kitchen maids, a housekeeper, 2 chambermaids, a laundress, and a groundskeeper. During the Slover era, enslaved labor made this possible at no direct wage cost, though the economic investment in purchasing and maintaining enslaved people was substantial. After the war, when labor had to be paid, the mathematics changed. A head housekeeper in 1870s, New Bern earned approximately $15 per month, roughly $450 in today's currency. Kitchen staff earned $10 to $12 monthly. Laundresses, whose hands swelled and ached from lye soap and scalding water, received $8. A groundskeeper maintaining the gardens and coal supply commanded $18. Total monthly payroll for a house like this, approximately $90. In modern terms, that's $2,700 per month, or $32,000 per year, just for basic staff. The workday began at 5 in the morning. Fires had to be lit, water heated, breakfast prepared before the family stirred at 7. The labor continued until 9 or 10 at night. After dinner was served, dishes cleaned, and the house secured. 15-hour days, 6 days a week. The elegant parlors where the Slover family entertained guests, they existed because someone else scrubbed the floors on their knees. The spotless linens, someone else boiled them in massive copper kettles. The manicured gardens visible from those tall windows, someone else worked the soil in the brutal summer heat. This was the invisible machine that powered every grand estate of the Gilded Age. The house was never just brick and mortar. It was an engine of human effort, and the fuel was other people's time. Now, let's meet the man who would one day try to own this machine, not understanding that some debts can never be repaid. In 1867, the same year Charles Slover was consolidating his fortune in this mansion, a baby was born 70 miles south in the small town of Chinquapin. His name was Caleb Davis Bradham, and the journey that would bring him to this house would begin with a dream of healing and end with a lesson about the cost of ambition. His father, George Washington Bradham, was a moderately successful businessman, and his mother, Julia McCann Bradham, came from a family with deep American roots. One of Caleb's ancestors had served as an officer in George Washington's army during the Revolutionary War. From his earliest years, Caleb showed an unusual combination of curiosity and ambition. He enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1886, where he distinguished himself as a student and became a member of the prestigious Philanthropic Society. After graduating, he set his sights on becoming a doctor and enrolled in the University of Maryland School of Medicine. The young man from rural North Carolina was building a path toward respectability and success. Then disaster struck. His father's business collapsed into bankruptcy, and suddenly there was no money to pay for medical school. Caleb was forced to abandon his dreams of becoming a physician and return home to North Carolina. It was a crushing blow for a young man who had worked so hard and come so close to achieving his goals. But Caleb Bradham was not the kind of man who gave up easily. If he could not be a doctor, he would find another way to use his knowledge of chemistry and medicine to help people. He took a teaching job at Vance Academy in New Bern, a private school where he could earn enough money to consider his next move. During this time, he returned to the University of Maryland, this time enrolling in the School of Pharmacy. In 1895, he obtained his pharmacist license in North Carolina. Now he had the credentials he needed. Bradham purchased a small drugstore at the corner of Middle and Pollock Streets in downtown New Bern and established Bradham's Pharmacy. Like most pharmacies of the era, the store featured a soda fountain where customers could enjoy refreshing drinks while they waited for their prescriptions. It was at this soda fountain that Caleb Bradham would change his life, and eventually the beverage industry, forever. The 1890s were a golden age for soda fountains. These gleaming marble and brass fixtures had become gathering places in communities across America, spots where neighbors could meet, gossip, and enjoy a cool drink on a hot afternoon. Pharmacists competed to create the most appealing beverages, mixing syrups and carbonated water in endless combinations. Caleb Bradham threw himself into this creative competition with enthusiasm. He experimented constantly, combining different flavors and ingredients in search of the perfect refreshing drink. His medical background gave him an advantage. He understood how different substances affected the body, and he was determined to create a beverage that was not only delicious, but also healthful. At a time when many soft drinks contained harmful ingredients, including cocaine and other narcotics, Bradham insisted on using only safe, natural components. In 1893, after countless experiments, he created something special. The drink combined carbonated water, sugar, caramel, lemon oil, nutmeg, and extracts from cola nuts. When his customers tasted it, they knew immediately that this was different from anything else available. They began asking for it by name, calling it Brad's drink after its inventor. The beverage became incredibly popular at the soda fountain. Customers came specifically to try the new concoction, and word spread throughout New Bern and beyond. Bradham realized he had created something with commercial potential far beyond his small pharmacy. In 1898, he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He renamed his creation Pepsi-Cola, combining the word pepsin, a digestive enzyme, with cola, a reference to the cola nut extract in the formula. Bradham believed his drink aided digestion, and he wanted the name to reflect what he saw as its health benefits. Despite its name, the beverage never actually contained pepsin, but Bradham felt the association with digestive health would appeal to customers. On January 4, 1901, Caleb Bradham married Charity Cradle, a woman from a respected New Bern family. Their wedding was a happy occasion, marking the beginning of what would become a prosperous partnership. Together, they would have 3 children: Mary, Caleb Jr., and George. The young family settled into life in New Bern, with Caleb dividing his time between the pharmacy and his growing beverage business. The following year, Bradham decided it was time to turn Pepsi-Cola into a real company. On December 24, 1902, he incorporated the Pepsi-Cola Company in North Carolina, with himself as president. He filed for a trademark with the United States Patent Office, and on June 16, 1903, Pepsi-Cola became officially registered. It was one of the earliest trademarks in American history, a distinction that reflected Bradham's business savvy and his understanding of the importance of protecting his creation. His friend and neighbor, Bayard Wooten, a pioneering female photographer who would later become famous for her images of the American South, created the company's first logo. The distinctive red script became instantly recognizable, appearing on bottles, advertisements, and storefronts across the region. By 1903, demand for Pepsi-Cola had grown beyond what Bradham could produce in the back room of his pharmacy. He moved the operation to a rented warehouse nearby and began selling the syrup in earnest. That first year, he sold nearly 8,000 gallons. His tagline captured the spirit of the beverage perfectly: exhilarating, invigorating, aids digestion. The business grew at an astonishing pace. In 1905, Bradham purchased a building in New Bern, known as the Bishop Factory, for $5,000, roughly $170,000 in today's money, and moved all bottling and syrup operations to this location. He began selling Pepsi-Cola in 6-ounce bottles, expanding beyond the soda fountain trade to reach customers in grocery stores and restaurants. Sales climbed to nearly 20,000 gallons. That same year, Bradham awarded his first 2 bottling franchises to businessmen in Charlotte and Durham. This franchise model was revolutionary. Instead of trying to build a massive manufacturing operation himself, Bradham licensed local entrepreneurs to produce and distribute Pepsi-Cola in their regions. They would buy the syrup from his company and handle everything else. It was a strategy that allowed for rapid expansion without enormous capital investment. By 1910, the results were spectacular. Pepsi-Cola had grown from a local curiosity to a regional sensation. There were 240 bottling franchises operating in 24 states, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. Bradham's small pharmacy experiment had become a national brand. To celebrate this success, Bradham convened the first ever Pepsi-Cola Bottlers Convention in New Bern. Franchisees traveled from across the country to meet the man who had created the drink that was making them all wealthy. Bradham hosted them in grand style, even taking them aboard the Alfreda, a vessel that had served in the Spanish-American War and had been refitted as a yacht. The event announced to the world that Pepsi-Cola had arrived as a major player in the American beverage industry. And in 1908, at the height of his early success, Caleb Bradham purchased the finest house in New Bern, the former Slover Mansion on Middle Street. It was a fitting residence for a man who had risen from bankruptcy and disappointment to become one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the South. The house that had sheltered Civil War generals would now be home to the king of Pepsi-Cola. For Bradham, buying the mansion was more than just a display of wealth. It was a statement about his place in society. But there was something else, something deeper, that drew him to this particular house. Something we need to examine closely. Because the mansion Caleb Bradham bought in 1908 wasn't just a home. It was a fortress. And the man who walked through those Greek Revival columns was still carrying a wound from 1890, a failure that had never fully healed. The house was going to be his surgical mask, his proof to the world that the boy who couldn't afford medical school had become someone who mattered. The Flemish bond brickwork wasn't just decorative, it was deliberate. Each brick in that intricate pattern required precise placement, alternating headers and stretchers in a sequence that announced craftsmanship, expense, and permanence. When Bradham stood before those walls in 1908, studying the house Charles Slover had built 60 years earlier, he wasn't seeing real estate. He was seeing proof. Proof that a man from Chinquapin who had failed at medicine could own what a shipping magnate had created. Proof that the boy who couldn't afford tuition could now afford grandeur. Proof that the wound from 1890, when his father's bankruptcy forced him to abandon medical school, could be covered by something magnificent enough to make people forget it ever existed. The Greek Revival columns rising from that front porch? They weren't supporting the roof. They were supporting Bradham's sense of worth. Think about what happens in the mind of a young man who gets within reach of becoming a doctor, then has it ripped away through no fault of his own. That kind of failure leaves a mark, not the kind that teaches you something useful, the kind that whispers in the back of your mind for the rest of your life. You weren't good enough. You didn't finish. You failed. Bradham spent the next 18 years proving that voice wrong. The pharmacy license, the soda fountain experiments, the Pepsi-Cola empire, all of it was evidence in the trial he was running against himself. But evidence doesn't silence the whisper. Architecture does. When he purchased the Slover mansion, the transaction wasn't recorded as just real estate. It was a psychological surgery. He was taking the house where Union generals had made history, where the wealthiest families in New Bern had built their legacy, and he was claiming it as his own. The house became his credentials, the diploma he never received from the University of Maryland School of Medicine. The purchase price has been lost to history, but similar Greek Revival mansions in that era sold for $15,000 to $25,000. In today's money, that's roughly $450,000 to $750,000. Bradham paid it without hesitation. But here's what makes this architectural choice so revealing. He didn't build a new house. He bought history. A new mansion would have announced wealth, but this house announced belonging. It said, "I own the place where your grandfathers made decisions that shaped this state. I stand where generals stood. My children play in rooms where history happened." It was a purchase designed not just to impress neighbors, but to rewrite his own story. The pharmacist from Chinquapin had become a pillar of the New Bern community, and he used that house as the platform. He served on the Craven County Board of Commissioners, president of the People's Bank of New Bern, an active Shriner, eventually reaching the 32nd degree of the Scottish Rite. He co-founded the North Carolina Naval Militia and served for 25 years in the Navy Reserve, eventually retiring as a Rear Admiral. In 1914, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels appointed him to the General Naval Militia Board. His name was even mentioned as a potential candidate for governor of North Carolina. Everything Caleb Bradham touched seemed to turn to gold. The Bradham family settled into their new home with joy. The house that had witnessed so much history now echoed with the laughter of children. Mary, Caleb Jr., and George explored the grand rooms where generals had once plotted strategy and merchants had counted their fortunes. Charity Bradham presided over the household with grace, hosting dinners and social events that cemented the family's position among New Bern's elite. From the tall windows of his study, Caleb could look out over the city where he had built his empire. The pharmacy, where it all began, was just a short walk away on the corner of Middle and Pollock Streets. The Bishop factory, where workers filled bottles with the distinctive Pepsi-Cola syrup, hummed with activity. Everything was perfect. But perfection built on a psychological foundation has a flaw. When you construct your entire sense of worth on external achievements, on buildings and titles and bank accounts, you become vulnerable to anything that threatens those structures. you become willing to take enormous risks to protect them. You start to believe that the mask is the face. And in 1915, as Bradham looked out from those tall windows at his thriving empire, he couldn't have known that within 8 years the house would become something else entirely. Not a proof of success, a monument to hubris. The years that followed brought continued growth. Pepsi-Cola sales increased steadily, and the franchise network expanded across the country. The company introduced new advertising campaigns featuring women and celebrities, emphasizing the drink's refreshing and invigorating qualities. Bradham was one of the first beverage manufacturers to embrace motor transport for shipping, understanding that speed and efficiency were crucial in the competitive soft drink market. In 1915, the future seemed impossibly bright. Pepsi-Cola was sold across 7 southeastern states, generating profits of over $31,000, roughly $930,000 in today's money. Bradham was wealthy, respected, and successful beyond anything he could have imagined when he was a struggling medical student forced to abandon his dreams. But 1915 was also the year that Europe descended into the most destructive war the world had ever seen. The Great War, as it was called then, seemed far away from the peaceful streets of New Bern. American factories were actually benefiting from the conflict, supplying the Allied powers with goods and materials. For Bradham and Pepsi-Cola, the war initially appeared to be just another opportunity for growth. He had no idea that within 3 years, a single commodity, rationed by the government at 3 cents per pound, would set the stage for a gamble that would cost him everything he had built. Then in 1917, America entered the war. Everything changed. The United States government implemented sweeping measures to support the war effort, including the rationing of essential commodities. Sugar, a crucial ingredient in soft drink production, was among the most strictly controlled substances. The government set the price at just 3 cents per pound, roughly 90 cents in today's money, and allocated limited quantities to manufacturers. For Pepsi-Cola, which depended on sugar for its distinctive taste, this was a serious problem. Bradham tried everything to keep production going. He experimented with sugar substitutes, including molasses, hoping to maintain the quality his customers expected. Nothing worked. The alternative sweeteners changed the taste of the drink, disappointing loyal customers who had come to love the original formula. Sales plummeted as Pepsi-Cola struggled to produce enough syrup to meet even reduced demand. The rationing continued for nearly 2 years, weakening companies across the beverage industry. Bradham watched his carefully built empire erode month by month as factories sat idle and franchises struggled to survive. He was convinced that once the war ended, things would return to normal. He just had to hold on. Then, in November 1918, the armistice was signed. The war was over. The government lifted price controls, and sugar became freely available again. For Caleb Bradham, this should have been the moment of salvation, the chance to rebuild everything he had lost. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. What happened next would become one of the most famous business disasters in American history. The price of sugar, freed from government control, did not simply return to pre-war levels. It skyrocketed. From 3 cents per pound, 90 cents in modern currency, the price climbed steadily through late 1918 and into 1919. By the summer of 1920, sugar was selling for an astonishing 28 cents per pound, roughly $8.40 in today's money, nearly 10 times its wartime price. Bradham, like many businessmen of his era, watched this price increase with a mixture of anxiety and opportunity. He needed sugar to restart full production, but he also saw a chance to protect himself from further increases by buying in bulk. If prices kept rising, he reasoned, having a large stockpile of sugar would give Pepsi-Cola a competitive advantage. He could maintain production while his competitors scrambled to find affordable supplies. It was a gamble that had worked for others. It was a gamble that seemed logical, given the market conditions. It was a gamble that would destroy everything Caleb Bradham had built. He purchased massive quantities of sugar, at 28 cents per pound, $8.40 in modern terms, committing the company's resources to what he believed would be a smart investment. Warehouses filled with bags of sugar. The inventory represented millions of dollars and years of profits. Then the market collapsed. Within weeks of Bradham's purchase, sugar prices began to fall. The spike had been driven by speculation and panic buying, not genuine supply shortages. As more sugar reached the market, prices tumbled. They dropped to 20 cents, then 15, then 10. By the time the collapse was complete, sugar was selling for just 5 cents per pound, roughly $1.50 in today's money. Caleb Bradham was left holding an enormous inventory of sugar that had cost nearly 6 times what it was now worth. He had bet the company on rising prices, and he had lost catastrophically. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. He could not sell the sugar without taking devastating losses. He could not use it all before it spoiled. He could not borrow enough money to cover the gap between what he had paid and what the sugar was worth. The man who had built Pepsi-Cola from nothing watched helplessly as his creation slipped away. Creditors demanded payment. Franchisees who depended on the syrup grew desperate. Banks that had been happy to lend money to one of New Bern's most successful businessmen now called in their loans. On May 31, 1923, Caleb Bradham and the Pepsi-Cola Company filed for bankruptcy. The assets, including the trademark, the formula, and the entire business infrastructure, were sold to the Craven Holding Corporation for $30,000. In today's currency, that's roughly $550,000. $30,000 for a company that had once been valued in the millions. $30,000 for 2 decades of work, innovation, and dreams. Bradham was ruined. The bankruptcy stripped away nearly everything he had accumulated. The Bishop factory was gone. The franchise network he had built was gone. The company that bore his name would continue without him, passing through multiple owners before eventually becoming the global giant we know today. But Caleb Bradham would have no part in that future. The bankruptcy of 1923 did not take everything from Caleb Bradham. He still had his family, he still had his pharmacy license, and remarkably, he still had the mansion on Middle Street. The house that had sheltered Civil War generals and witnessed the birth of a beverage empire would remain his home through the darkest years of his life. But the man who walked those hallways after the bankruptcy was not the same confident entrepreneur who had purchased the property 15 years earlier. The spring had gone out of his step. The sparkle had faded from his eyes. Caleb Bradham had gambled everything on his belief that sugar prices would keep rising, and he had lost in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The house he bought to prove he mattered, the fortress he built against the world's judgment, had become something else. A witness to failure, a monument to hubris. And for the next 11 years, until his death in 1934, Bradham would live inside that monument, unable to escape what it had come to represent. In the immediate aftermath of the bankruptcy, Bradham did what he had always done when faced with adversity. He went back to work. The Pepsi-Cola Company was gone, sold to strangers for a fraction of its worth, but Bradham's pharmacy still stood on the corner of Middle and Pollock Streets. The soda fountain where he had first mixed Brad's drink still gleamed in the afternoon light. If he could not be a soft drink magnate, he would be what he had always been, a pharmacist. There was dignity in this return to his roots, even if there was also heartbreak. Every day, Bradham walked past reminders of what he had built and lost. The Bishop factory, where workers had once filled thousands of bottles with Pepsi-Cola syrup, stood silent. The franchise network he had created continued to operate, but under new ownership, sending profits to investors who had never mixed a single batch of the drink. The trademark he had registered in 1903, one of the earliest in American history, now belonged to someone else entirely. The people of New Bern watched their fallen hero with a mixture of sympathy and respect. Bradham had been one of them, a local boy who had achieved national success. His failure was painful to witness, but it did not diminish the affection his neighbors felt for him. They continued to bring their prescriptions to his pharmacy. They continued to greet him warmly on the streets. They understood that the sugar gamble had been a reasonable decision that simply went wrong, the kind of bad luck that could strike anyone. What made Bradham's situation even more poignant was his continued generosity despite his reduced circumstances. Even after losing his company, he maintained the scholarship prize he had established at the University of North Carolina School of Pharmacy back in 1902. Year after year, he found the money to support young pharmacists pursuing their dreams, even when his own dreams lay in ruins. He continued this commitment until 1930, just 4 years before his death, when his declining health and finances finally made it impossible to continue. His involvement in community affairs also persisted. He remained active in the Shriners, participating in charitable events and maintaining the friendships he had built during his years of success. The Brotherhood of the Lodge provided comfort and purpose during his darkest days. His fellow Shriners did not judge him for his business failure. They remembered the generous man who had hosted conventions and supported charitable causes when his pockets were deep. Now they supported him in return, offering fellowship and respect when he needed it most. His service in the Naval Reserve continued, a source of pride that had nothing to do with soft drinks or sugar prices. The rank of Rear Admiral was his to keep, earned through 25 years of dedicated service to his country. When Bradham put on his naval uniform for official functions, he was not a failed businessman. He was a patriot who had devoted a quarter-century to defending his nation. That identity could not be taken from him by creditors or collapsing sugar markets. The rhythm of small-town pharmacy work provided its own kind of healing. There was satisfaction in filling prescriptions, in helping neighbors manage their ailments, in being a trusted source of medical advice for families who could not always afford to see a doctor. Bradham had started his career wanting to be a physician, wanting to heal people. In a way, the bankruptcy had returned him to that original calling. The path was different than he had imagined, but the purpose remained the same. But the financial pressure never fully relented. Maintaining the mansion on Middle Street was expensive. The 3-story brick house with its elegant proportions and historic significance required constant attention. The roof needed repairs. The heating system demanded fuel. The grounds required care. For a man living on the modest income of a small-town pharmacy, these costs were a constant burden. A house this size, in modern terms, would require roughly $15,000 to $20,000 per year in maintenance, taxes, and utilities. On a pharmacist's salary in the 1920s, that was crushing. Yet Bradham refused to leave. The house had become more than just a residence. It was a symbol of everything he had achieved, a tangible reminder that he had once stood among the most successful businessmen in the South. Selling it would have been an admission of complete defeat, a final surrender that his pride would not permit. So he stayed, economizing where he could, watching the paint fade and the gardens grow wild in places, but never abandoning the home he loved. The rooms that had once hosted lavish dinner parties now stood quieter. The chandeliers dimmed to save on electricity, the fireplaces cold to conserve fuel, but the bones of the house remained magnificent. The Flemish bond brickwork that Hardy Lane's craftsmen had laid so carefully in 1848 showed no signs of weakening. The proportions that had made it the finest residence in antebellum New Bern retained their perfect balance. Even in reduced circumstances, the Slover-Bradham House possessed a dignity that could not be diminished by financial misfortune. Charity Bradham stood by her husband through all of it. The woman who had married a promising young pharmacist in 1901 had watched him rise to extraordinary heights and then fall to devastating lows. Through it all, she remained his partner and his support. Together, they raised their 3 children in the shadow of both success and failure, teaching them by example that character matters more than circumstance. The children grew up understanding the strange duality of their situation. They lived in one of the finest houses in New Bern, a mansion with a history that stretched back before the Civil War. But they also knew that their father had lost a fortune, that the name Pepsi-Cola, which he had created, now belonged to others, and that the family's circumstances were far more modest than their address might suggest. Mary, Caleb Jr., and George learned resilience from watching their parents face adversity with grace. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the broader economy collapsed into the Great Depression. Businesses failed across the country. Banks closed their doors. Unemployment soared to levels that seemed impossible. For Caleb Bradham, who had already experienced his own personal depression, there was a bitter irony in watching the rest of America join him in hardship. The Pepsi-Cola company he had founded continued its troubled existence during these years. After the bankruptcy, the brand had passed through multiple owners, none of whom managed to recapture the success of the Bradham era. In 1931, the company declared bankruptcy again, its second failure in less than a decade. But this time, a new owner named Charles Guth saw potential in the struggling brand. He would eventually transform Pepsi-Cola into a genuine competitor to Coca-Cola, building the foundation for the global corporation that exists today. Bradham watched these developments from afar, reading about his creation in newspapers and trade publications. He took no part in the company's revival. He received no compensation for the success that others would build on his foundation. The formula he had developed in the back room of his pharmacy, the trademark he had registered, the brand identity he had created, all of it belonged to strangers now. Sometimes, walking through New Bern, he would see someone drinking a bottle of Pepsi-Cola. The familiar logo that Bayard Wooten had designed would catch his eye, and for a moment, he would remember the excitement of those early years, the thrill of watching his creation spread across the country. Then the moment would pass, and he would continue on his way. A man separated from his legacy by the cruel mathematics of a sugar speculation gone wrong. His health began to decline in the early 1930s. The exact nature of his illness was described simply as a long-term condition, though some accounts suggest it was related to hardening of the arteries and heart disease. The stress of the bankruptcy and the years of financial struggle had taken their toll on a man who had once seemed indestructible. The energy that had driven him to build a national company from a soda fountain experiment slowly drained away. The pharmacy on Middle Street, which had been his refuge and his livelihood since the bankruptcy, suffered a devastating blow when fire swept through the building. The flames consumed the space where Brad's drink had first been created, where customers had gathered around the soda fountain to taste something new and exciting. Bradham lost not just a business, but a physical connection to the happiest years of his professional life. A new building would eventually rise on the same spot, but Bradham would not live to see it become a shrine to his memory. Today, that location houses the birthplace of Pepsi Store, where visitors can learn about the history of the drink and the man who created it. But in the early 1930s, it was simply a pile of ashes and charred timber. Another loss in a life that had known too many. Through the final months of his life, Bradham remained in the mansion on Middle Street, the house that had seen so much history, prepared to witness one more chapter. The bedroom where he lay was the same room where he had dreamed of expansion and success, where he had calculated profits and planned advertising campaigns, where he had held his children when they were small and watched them grow into adults. Charity was with him constantly during these final days, as were their children when they could be there. The family that had weathered so much together now faced the ultimate separation. Outside the tall windows, New Bern continued its daily rhythms, largely unaware that one of its most remarkable citizens was slipping away. On February 19, 1934, Caleb Davis Bradham died in his beloved mansion. He was 66 years old. The cause of death was listed as hardening of the arteries with complications, the cumulative result of years of stress and declining health. The man who had invented one of the world's most famous beverages passed away in relative obscurity, his name already fading from public memory, even as his creation grew stronger under new ownership. His funeral was held at First Presbyterian Church, where he had been a devoted member for decades. The sanctuary filled with mourners who had known him in different capacities, as a pharmacist, as a businessman, as a civic leader, as a friend. The pallbearers were his brothers from the New Bern Masonic Lodge, men who had known him through triumph and tragedy, who had watched him rise and fall, and rise again in spirit, if not in fortune. The service was dignified and well attended, a testament to the respect that Bradham had earned, not through his business success but through his character. The minister spoke of a life dedicated to service, to family, to community. He spoke of a man who had faced devastating loss with grace and had never abandoned his commitment to helping others. He spoke of resilience, of dignity, of faith that endured even when circumstances were cruel. What the minister did not say, what perhaps no one fully understood at the time, was that Caleb Bradham's greatest legacy was not the beverage that would eventually become a global icon. It was the house itself. The mansion on Middle Street would outlive its owner by decades, standing as silent witness to a truth that took years to understand. Bradham had bought it as a mask to hide failure, but in the end it became something else entirely, a monument not to what he owned but to what he refused to surrender. Because the real question was never whether he could afford to keep the house. The question was whether he could afford to let it go. They buried him in Cedar Grove Cemetery, just blocks from the site of his original pharmacy. The cemetery had been the final resting place for New Bern's prominent citizens since before the Civil War. Confederate soldiers who died in the Battle of New Bern lay nearby, as did generations of merchants, politicians, and community leaders. Caleb Bradham joined their ranks, his grave marked by a simple stone that gave little hint of his extraordinary story. Years later, a smaller marker would be added to his grave, bearing just 2 words that captured his greatest achievement: inventor of Pepsi. It was a modest tribute to a man whose creation would eventually become one of the most valuable brands on earth, generating billions of dollars in annual revenue and employing hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. But Bradham himself never saw a penny of that success. His fortune was made and lost in the span of 2 decades, leaving him with nothing but memories and a house full of history. Charity Bradham survived her husband by many years, eventually passing away and joining him in Cedar Grove Cemetery. Their children scattered to build their own lives, carrying with them the lessons of their remarkable upbringing. The Bradham name gradually faded from New Bern's social register, remembered mainly by historians and those with a particular interest in the origins of Pepsi-Cola. But the house on Middle Street endured. After Bradham's death in 1934, the mansion passed through various hands. The grand residence that had sheltered a Civil War headquarters and a soft drink empire became simply another historic house in a town full of them. New owners came and went, each adding their own chapter to the building's long story, each walking the same hallways where Charles Slover had entertained guests, where Union generals had planned campaigns, where Caleb Bradham had celebrated success and mourned failure. The house's historical significance was formally recognized in 1973 when it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The designation acknowledged not just the building's architectural merit, but its extraordinary role in American history. Few houses anywhere in the country could claim such a diverse and compelling past. A wealthy merchant's showpiece, a Civil War headquarters, the home of a beverage pioneer. The house had been all of these things and more. Today, the Slover-Bradham House still stands at 256 Middle Street in New Bern. Its 3-story brick facade, laid in the distinctive Flemish bond pattern, looks much as it did when Hardy Lane's workers completed it in 1849. The brownstone trim still accents the windows and doors. The proportions that made it the most imposing residence in antebellum New Bern remain perfectly balanced and pleasing to the eye. Time has been kind to the old mansion, preserving its essential character even as the world around it has changed beyond recognition. The house is privately owned now, carefully maintained by people who understand and appreciate its significance. It appears occasionally on historic home tours, allowing visitors to step inside and imagine the layers of history that have accumulated within its walls. They can stand in rooms where generals debated strategy, where a pharmacist dreamed of building a beverage empire, where a family faced triumph and tragedy with equal grace. Just a few blocks away, the birthplace of Pepsi store occupies the site where Bradham's original pharmacy once stood. The building itself is newer, constructed after the fire that destroyed the original, but it has been fitted with displays and artifacts that tell the story of Pepsi-Cola's origins. Visitors can see photographs of Caleb Bradham, examine early bottles and advertising materials, and even enjoy a fountain Pepsi mixed in the traditional style. It has become a pilgrimage site for fans of the beverage and students of American business history. The contrast between these two locations tells the story of Caleb Bradham's life in miniature. The modest storefront where he invented his famous drink represents the creativity and ambition that made his success possible. The grand mansion where he lived and died represents the heights he reached and the distance he had to fall. Together they form a memorial to a man who changed the beverage industry forever, but never fully enjoyed the fruits of his innovation. New Bern itself has embraced its identity as the birthplace of Pepsi. The city celebrates Bradham's legacy with events and commemorations, recognizing that his invention put their small town on the map in a way that few other achievements could match. In 1998, the centennial of Pepsi-Cola's naming was marked with a parade, fireworks, a memorabilia show, and even a play based on Bradham's life. Dignitaries and soft drink enthusiasts gathered to honor the pharmacist who had changed the beverage world forever. The company that had grown from his pharmacy experiment, now headquartered far away in Purchase, New York, acknowledged its humble origins by holding shareholder meetings in New Bern, bringing corporate executives and investors to walk the same streets where Bradham had once dreamed of building an empire. The story of Caleb Bradham and his mansion offers lessons that resonate far beyond the beverage industry. It is a story about the American dream in all its complexity, about the possibility of rising from nothing to build something extraordinary, and about the fragility of success when it depends on forces beyond our control. Bradham did everything right for 20 years, building a company through innovation, hard work, and smart business decisions. Then a single gamble on sugar prices wiped it all away. Some might see his story as a tragedy, and in many ways it was. He created something that would become worth billions of dollars, yet he died with little to show for it. He built a national brand, yet he spent his final years running a small-town pharmacy. He purchased a mansion that symbolized his success, yet he struggled to maintain it as his fortune evaporated. But there is another way to view Caleb Bradham's life. He faced devastating setbacks not once, but twice. First, when his father's bankruptcy forced him to abandon medical school, and again when his own company collapsed. Both times he picked himself up and found a way forward. He never stopped working, never stopped contributing to his community, never stopped supporting young pharmacists through his scholarship fund. The bankruptcy took his company, but it did not take his character. The house on Middle Street stands as a monument to that resilience. Its walls have witnessed war and peace, success and failure, joy and sorrow. Through it all, it has endured, just as Bradham himself endured until the end. The bricks that Hardy Lane's workers laid in 1848 still hold strong. The rooms where so much history unfolded still stand ready to shelter new generations. When visitors walk past the Slover-Bradham House today, most of them have no idea what they are seeing. To them, it is simply a beautiful old building in a town full of beautiful old buildings. But those who know the story see something more. They see the home of a man who dared to dream big, who turned a pharmacy experiment into a national phenomenon, who lost everything and kept going anyway. They see a house that remembers. In the end, Caleb Bradham's greatest legacy may not be the drink that bears a name he created. It may be the example he set of how to face failure with dignity and how to find meaning in life even when your grandest plans have crumbled to dust. The mansion where he spent his final years, where he watched his creation flourish under other hands, where he died surrounded by family and memories, stands as a testament to a life fully lived. The beverage he invented is enjoyed by millions of people every day in nearly every country on earth. PepsiCo has grown into one of the largest food and beverage companies in history, with annual revenues exceeding $90 billion. The brand that Bradham created in the back room of his New Bern pharmacy has become a global icon, recognized everywhere from Tokyo to Toronto, from Cairo to Caracas. None of that wealth ever returned to the Bradham family. None of that success ever benefited the man who started it all. But his name lives on, inscribed on a modest marker in Cedar Grove Cemetery, and remembered by those who take the time to learn about the origins of one of America's most famous products. The Slover-Bradham House continues its quiet vigil on Middle Street, its windows looking out over a New Bern that Caleb Bradham would barely recognize. The pharmacy where he mixed his first batches of Brad's drink is long gone, replaced by a tribute to the creation that outlived its creator. The Bishop factory, where workers filled bottles with Pepsi-Cola syrup, has been converted to other uses or demolished entirely. The franchise network he built has been outsourced into a corporate structure of unimaginable size and complexity. But the house remains. The house remembers. And for those who seek it out, the house still tells its story. A story of ambition and innovation, of success and failure, of a man who created something extraordinary and then watched it slip away. It is a uniquely American story, set in a uniquely American place, and it deserves to be remembered as long as people still reach for a cold Pepsi on a hot afternoon. The house had been a mask for failure, then a fortress against the world. In the end, it became proof that some things matter more than money. Caleb Davis Bradham may have died in relative obscurity, his fortune gone and his company in other hands, but he left behind something that money cannot measure. He left behind a legacy of perseverance, a house full of history, and a drink that brings refreshment to millions. That is the tragic story of the Pepsi family mansion. That is the story of the Caleb Bradham estate. And that is a story that will endure as long as the old brick walls on Middle Street continue to stand against the Carolina sky. If you enjoyed this deep investigation into Gilded Age architecture and the hidden psychology behind America's great estates, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories like this. Because every mansion has a story. Every brick holds a secret. And sometimes, the most valuable thing a person can own isn't a company worth billions. It's the dignity to keep standing when everything else falls away. The Slover-Bradham House still stands on Middle Street in New Bern, North Carolina. The same Flemish bond brickwork. The same Greek revival columns. The same windows that watched Caleb Bradham rise, fall, and refuse to surrender. And if you ever find yourself in New Bern, walk past that house, look up at those windows, and remember that the greatest fortunes are not always measured in dollars. Thank you for watching,